Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info.
We'll send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative. I am Milton, and I'm here with William.
Hello.
And Rhonda.
Hello.
And we are here to talk about nature connection. So, I think nature connection can reflect through a lot of the petals of the permaculture flower, where we always start. Particularly, some are obvious, but I think others are not so obvious. For example, building and how closely do you see nature in your building design? Do you have wood paneling or is it painted drywall? That environment that you live in influences your mindset about the external environment. So that's just one example.
So here we have a couple of pictures on the left and the center of a group of people from a workshop called The Art of Mentoring, which I got to attend 2 years ago. And then on the right is a picture of my son Caden in our garden, who has grown up both with nature connection and permaculture. And a lot of times it's interesting to think about what is the connection between permaculture design and nature connection practices. There's a lot of interest. This is an emerging bridge between two different groups of people where there's lots of crossover. And one of the connections is that Mollison in particular was very conscious that we should be honoring indigenous cultures and their cultural technologies and ways of living with the earth as we think about permaculture. Another place where they both excel and emphasize is the observation of the landscape and learning to read the stories on the landscape. And coming right out of that is identification of the plants and animals and their patterns on the landscape and their contributions to the ecosystem and cultural systems. So I would say that nature connection and permaculture as a network of people are running parallel, and there's lots of connections between them, and they each can inform and support the other.
What I see with nature connection and permaculture is really trying to show us how to be in the landscape, like our place in the landscape in terms of our settlement patterns and how we arrange ourselves, whereas nature connection is really focused on us as the individual and our connection with the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think another way to say that is permaculture is really focused on the outside in, whereas nature connection is more on the inside out. I think they're doing virtually the same thing, but just different processes to achieve that result.
So these two pictures on the left, back from the Art of Mentoring, I'm going to say this is like my group for the week, my little clan within the larger group. And we were given a series of challenges, and one of the challenges was to get everybody up in one tree. So this picture is of everybody, including our elder, Helen, who's on the picture on the left, was up in the tree, which is really fun. So with nature connection and with permaculture, one of the things they share is the inspiration from and recognition of pattern in indigenous cultures and the value of indigenous cultures having intact cultures. And not all indigenous cultures have maintained that wholeness moving into the modern era. So one of the valuable contributions found in nature connection and the art of mentoring is the mapping of what a whole functioning culture looks like, including its art, its skills, its storytelling, its work with different generations, rites of passage, so on. So this contribution, which a student of permaculture who wants to look at permanent culture could take up through getting involved with the art of mentoring and nature connection practices, could enrich a practice, enrich our understandings. And it's wonderful to see in Mollison's introduction and theories about permaculture in the designer's manual that he recognized the same need, the same wholeness that was present in indigenous cultures.
There's a story that each pattern has to tell about where it came from and where it's going. And as we design, knowing those stories, we can incorporate them into the larger story that we're trying to tell as designers.
Some of the things for us to recognize is that the nature connection gives us a rudimentary scientific process, you might say, that through our direct observation of the phenomena around us, the movement of animals, the flows of water, the flowering of different flowers and fruiting of different foods, it helps inform our own understanding of what is happening around us and how that affects every other population, plant, animal, insect, and so on, so that we do that work of becoming more integrated with the natural world and seeing what the animals value and how they behave, how the plants respond to each other, creates an opportunity for us to value the things that we tend to take for granted, but which might actually be really important for us as medicine or fiber or water or so on. So the best designers in permaculture design also tend to have really deep observation skills and deep connection with nature. Here in slide 5, one of the easiest ways to step into nature connection is just to start to practice what's called a sit spot. So going out every day to the same spot and seeing how things change around you at the same time of day, at different times of day, and then changing up to different areas that you can go to so that you start to build up a muscle of observation and appreciation and connection. And that has a lot of benefits to you as an individual, just in terms of mental health or peacefulness and putting other things that are going on in your life in perspective.
And also, I view the sit spot as not necessarily being the place that you sit, but it's kind of a larger area, and looking at that larger area from many different angles and approaching it from different angles. So the picture on the right is my back porch, looking out onto the lawn and down towards the creek. Well, I often will sit out by the creek and kind of look back up at this spot. And so looking at that larger, it's a hillside down to the creek, and I think of it as a broader thing than just off my back porch.
Yeah. So the sit spot's super important for creating that connection with your area, with your space. And I like that you get those different perspectives. In my sit spot, really I've gotten to know there's a family of wrens that live in my area, and they hunt in my compost to hear their chatter and kind of know their different songs and see how they react with the environment. So you start to tease those things out. Another aspect of nature connection are games, and I'll throw in here childlike play, which we'll come back to in a minute, but all kinds of games, and wandering, like aimless, purposeless wandering. So there's an element in nature connection of practicing what are known as primitive skills, like archery or fire making, shelter building, finding water. Those are things which also deepen your connection and appreciation of what nature provides for you. The picture on the right of the cat stalking is another thing that people do, which is they learn how to move slowly with these different stalks. And that comes out of a tradition of people learning actually how to stalk wild animals, like to touch a deer. So mimicking animal movements is a kind of game. It's used in storytelling, especially if you have a cultural story that's based out of animals, like the tortoise and the hare. And so there's a lot of that. And that is a form of connecting to nature and the other beings on the planet. So that's a healthy thing to do. And I will say from experience that when you slow down and move through a space in a stalk kind of movement, you change your perspective and your observation very much. And it's actually, we're so busy all the time, rushing from here and there, that to just change your pace is a really nourishing thing to do. So another picture of my son on the left holding a little tree frog, and then a caterpillar over here on the right. And one of the things that when I'm mentored in Nature Connection frustrates the living daylights out of me is that the mentors do not tell you what things are. They ask you to observe and then look it up in an identification book so that you really learn it for yourself. They don't give you the easy answer. That can be frustrating because you just want the immediate gratification. But it does take you deeper into the observation process. So there's a lot to do with the art of questioning is one of the Nature Connection skills. And that leads you right into learning different plants, animals, and it's recommended that you keep a journal of your observations, maybe from your sit spot or a wander, which can be a very creative, satisfying process.
Yeah, I absolutely have to second the skill of looking up things that you do not know. It may not be the easiest way to meet a new plant or animal, but it definitely does sharpen your observation skills. I'm also fond of just introducing plants and animals to people as if they were another person. This is my friend, the rabbit, this is my friend Milkweed. But you definitely don't hone your skills that way, and it doesn't stick the same way.
Mm-hmm. So I would say learning these plants and learning these animals and those patterns directly translate to becoming a better permaculture practitioner, because it helps you either incorporate them into systems for design practice, or it helps you appreciate what is showing up and the usefulness of those plants and animals in the system.
At base level, you're learning the landscape where you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times there's the thought that we need to design every single aspect of something. Whereas, for instance, just to the right of the picture, that of my sit spot, there's a plant that came up and I didn't know what it was. And I watched it. It turns out it's a brown-eyed Susan, which I've never encountered before. But that plant wanted to grow there, and I'm quite happy leaving it and letting it be a part of the polyculture.
Yeah. So besides games and sit spots and learning animals, there are lots of other skills involved.
Yeah, a few here. The one on the left, that's my son on the left in the tie-dye, going to pick berries. And I think it's really important to start young with these sort of skills and kind of create that experience that he'll remember. And one thing that I focused on working with such a young child is just differentiating large brushstrokes, that there are yummy berries and there are yucky berries. And making sure that he knows that he can just say that's yummy, that's yucky, and asking him if he sees it, and not just running out there and pointing out all the yummy berries to him. So this is him and a friend of ours picking autumn olive berries at a local park.
There are a couple of other pictures here. One of a person working, it looks like with a hand drill.
It's a bow drill.
So bow drill is a form of fire making, and there's a whole range of things that you can do. There's bow drill and hand drill. There's a really fun bow drill form that you can do with a group of people that's very exciting. It's huge pieces, but it still works, right? And so that's one of the things that we say sets us apart as human beings is that we can make and control fire. And there's a whole range of lessons to be learned in how to do that, how to make the fire, which woods to use, what kind of condition those pieces need to be in, what form to take when that happens, how to keep a coal going so that you don't have to restart a fire. You can just tend the coals and extend them and then use them to start a new fire later. It's an entire art, as is tracking.
Right. The picture on the upper right is apparently a badger track through a field. And just seeing that, the information that gives you something else lives here, is sharing the space and moves through this landscape in a regular enough way that they've left a track through it. A lot of times it might be a lot more subtle, but this one's good for the slides.
Like the bear print we saw in the earlier slide, that's called a clear print track. And some of the two best tracking cultures that we know of, the Apache and the Kalahari Bushmen, both are on sandy soils. So they developed all these amazing tracking skills. But then when you get into prairie or woodland, you have other kinds of tracking that you're doing, and like this, where you see this trail through the space. But that's telling a story and following clues.
Well, and so there was a badger going through this trail. Where was he going to? Where was he coming from? What was he doing in those different places? And that kind of expands the story and really speaks to learning the larger story of a place. Especially as permaculturists, when we're talking about designing a place. What is this larger story that we're entering into a relationship with?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give a plug in here for a couple of different resources. We've talked about John Young, and he and Ellen Huss and Evan McGowan wrote a book called Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature. And that's one of the great places to go, a foundational piece for this nature connection aspect. But if you're really interested in tracking, there's a book to start with written by Paul Rezendes, Rezendes, called Tracking in the Art of Seeing, which can help you kind of start to identify different tracks and sign that you see. And then the third resource I would say is anything to do with Tom Brown Jr. and the Tracker School, because that's where a lot of this came from. Yeah, so Tom Brown Jr. has written The Tracker. He's known as The Tracker. But also he's written a lot of books that are guides, and they're all wonderful. Even like urban tracking kinds of books and urban skills. So the skills then come back. We're individuals, we practice skills, and then we come back into community, into connection with each other. And nature connection isn't just about connection to nature, but about how that then leads to common culture and persistent culture. So, we have 3 different celebrations here, and then this picture from India I loved because the choices of color, plant, pattern, they're all reflective of what is going on with the community and the land. And these kinds of celebrations, and we find them all around the globe. They have different histories. They maybe have been borrowed from one culture into another and modified, but we all have ancestors that were indigenous somewhere. We all have cultural practices that we've borrowed and adapted and which we replicate in ways that make sense to us. And those often have their ties in deep understandings of nature and how human life cycles match seasons and awarenesses. Nature connection draws on different lineages. So when you go to a workshop, you often are participating in or are hearing stories and honoring of elders and different groups of people who brought cultural patterns into the art of mentoring, into nature connection. And so part of what this art of mentoring group, this group is doing, is looking at what are the cultural patterns that are common between all indigenous cultures, so that we have basically a roadmap of how do we create permanent cultures or whole cultures. And I think what I heard last is that they've identified over 200 patterns.
Another pattern language.
It is another pattern language. And so, we talk about cultural appropriation, and we want to be very sensitive to that. But what's happening with the art of mentoring is that indigenous people who are aware of this are looking to see, oh, well, we have all these patterns. Maybe we have some to contribute. And here's something that you don't have, that we have, that you can take into your pattern language and use. And so there are pieces of this from Hawaii and from Africa and from the Apache and from just different places for peacemaking and storytelling and rites of passage they're beautiful and they're intense and they're very much a healing force.
Well, I think ultimately what this points to for me is that we all need to become native to the places that we live. And that means that we need to connect with them and the things that are going on there. Not just human things, but also the animal things and the plant things and the geological things, all of it. And plug into that. And in some ways, the culture that we come from has been mostly consumed by this commodified Western culture. At some point we were absorbed into that, and I think the way to move forward is to draw on all of these different patterns that we have available to us to make something that is local and that reflects the places where we live and the ways that we keep ourselves alive from those places.
So one more resource is that one of the first things that John Young and his group put out before it was Eight Shields is the Kamana, Kamana series. It's a workbook series of, I think there's 4 levels, but the first level, in the back of it, there's a 200-question tourist test. And you have to answer so many questions right to say, yes, you're native to this place, or no, you're just passing through as a tourist. And it's pretty eye-opening to answer those questions and see where you're at with it.
It's a tricky prospect because when you have a somewhat nomadic existence, in my case, I've lived so many places over time, it's a little trickier to plug into the story of a specific place for a long period of time. But I think the real value in that is when you do settle someplace, being able to connect to that there's people who have kept that story is preserved and communicated. That's what really has great value and allows you to plug in truly to the culture of a place.
The important thing, too, is not, oh, I scored really high on this test, but to assess accurately where you're at and start to open up your awareness. Because you then are on a journey or a quest. And that's the important thing, more than arriving.
Right. The path is the goal.
And that awareness building is one of the key aspects of permaculture, is to increase our awareness of where we are and what's going on around us, and then really to work on our process so that we make better decisions about how we interact with that place.
Yeah, so here we are back at the Permaculture Flower, and we've talked about this parallel group of people who have so many deep connections with permaculture as a network and a philosophy and design process. And you just said it beautifully, Milton.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.